Hi, I'm Eddie Lane, and I talk about cults. Why? Well, because I actually left one when I was about 24, and all I want now is to spread the word of how dangerous groups and churches can work and how to help someone else break free, if I can. To start off with, we're going to be studying Weibo Ludwig. This will be a two-part series, so please subscribe and then you'll know when the next one comes out. I'm really going to try to have it out in a day or two, so there's not much of a delay, and then we can get the whole story out, okay? Why am I studying this particular man, Weibo Ludwig? You may say, Whoig? But, well, he was close enough to me in the 90s to be right in my news circuit, and I was really deeply embedded in my own church at the time, so it was really the first taste I had with confronting the idea that I perhaps might be in a cult. Similar. Who is he? In the early 2010s, Ludwig was taken into custody by the RCMP in connection with bombings of Encana's pipelines in northern British Columbia. He had been the subject of controversy for decades in one way or another and completely infamous in the town of Hythe, Alberta. He fought with his neighbors, his professors, his peers, the church, the oil industry itself. Worst of all, Weibo Ludwig was all but responsible for the death of a teenage girl. But I'm getting ahead of myself. As a guide, I've taken several articles from a newspaper, the Edmonton Journal, that was written in 1999 and 2010. In fact, there's another very famous documentary called Weibo's War, and it's a little bit more on the sympathetic side. So if you're interested, that may be something to check out. Also, I want to mention that I will be giving links to various organizations that can help you leaving a cult or an organization at the end. Okay, let's begin. Weibo Arianus Ludwig was born in 1941, the youngest boy of 8 children during the climax of World War II, where his father had been a war hero and a leader in the Dutch resistance. His family came to Canada from Holland when he was about 10 and settled near Sylvan Lake and Red Deer, Alberta. He was a lively enough boy, but shy in front of crowds, and shaped forever, it seems, by his years in rural Alberta. A teacher Canadianized his name to Bill early on, and little Bill Ludwig was still teased for his Dutch dress and foreign manners. He was stuck, as many other immigrant children were, not quite a part of Canadian culture, but not rooted in his old Dutch one either. The older Ludwigs went straight to work to help establish the family, along with their father, who was constantly in his tailor shop. Young Bill started to believe that the Dutch immigrant families, his family included, were dominated by the spirit of materialism. He would later say, "The little kids like myself spent way too much time alone, and a child left to himself, says the scripture, will bring grief to his mother." In a letter to his family in 1989, he wrote, "Mother, nor the rest of you, know me hardly at all. For at least 5 years under your noses, I did things on a routine basis that should send shivers down your backs. And who took notice?" Now, my own family tree has many stories of growing up in these same areas and communities in Alberta. And it was very, very harsh living. You had to clear the land by yourself, the rocks, everything by hand, just to get it to the point where you could plant something on it. Children were left alone, fending for themselves through cold winters, living off mice and sleeping in barns. It's absolutely devastating stuff. Now, if this is what Bill Ludwig had to survive, I can understand why he was so bitter about it for so many years. But Ludwig has never told anybody what those things that he did in those years were. He said they were between himself and God. And at times, Ludwig refused to pray at dinner with the rest of his family. The Ludwigs were firmly part of the Dutch Reformed Church, just like everyone else. This is a Protestant-style church, so it's not so much Catholic, but it's almost as strict. If you don't wear the right tie to church or you don't say the right thing, you will be ostracized for a little while. So very rules-oriented. While others were bowing their heads for a prayer, Weibo was looking outside at the trees thinking, unless I can get into this real, I don't want to close my eyes and act like I'm getting into it. When he was 14, he wrote an article for the church bulletin board that condemned some elders for falling asleep in the pews. A little while later, he was so fed up that he left home, working for a few years in odd jobs as a logger before joining the Canadian Navy. That Dutch Protestant work ethic, though, it did not fail him. He worked hard, He played hard. A young Bill Ludwig played way too hard. Handsome, blonde, blue-eyed, tanned, and fit, he had female and male attention. Once he was hit on by a sailor when he was on leave in Florida. It was this, he said, that made him decide that most sailors were leading empty lives. He wanted some meaning. This was about when a hurricane hit him, a literal hurricane. This was Ludwig's favorite picture of himself, 18 years old, struggling to find the meaning of life. As he was on board the HMCS Iroquois in the Caribbean, a hurricane-force storm blew up one day, and all the lifeboats were knocked loose. The ship itself was knocked over several times, but only to be righted by the next wave. All the crew was below decks, but Bill, he stayed bravely above, storming the storm. Half the crew was puking its guts out, and the others were scared witless. I didn't think about it myself. I just thought, what a wonderful, powerful thing. I was very lonely, he said, but during the storm, with the power of the waves, I had a sense that the power of God was with me, and I felt, oh, I'm not so lonely. When the sky had cleared and the storm inside Ludwig was still only stirring, he began to respond to his morals. He would therefore leave the Navy after only 2 years. Now let's shift over to Sioux Center, Iowa in the 60s. This is a town in the northwest corner of the Iowa Corn Belt, where the Christian Reformed Church personified the close-knit community of Dutch immigrants. There were no bars, no dance halls, plenty of churches, and Christian schools. Yeah, it's basically the town in Footloose. Reverend B.J. Hahn was a notable man for founding the Dordt College, which still remains to this day. College students remember that the Father Reverend Hahn was an upbeat man, warm, and inviting, just like a politician. He was in the Time magazine after he had successfully opposed the opening of a movie theater in town. So, there you go. That's how he was. And they wonder why the 60s were all about rebellion. Now, Mamie Hahn, the Reverend Hahn's daughter. She'd grown up, as one might expect, being sheltered and scrutinized. It's a rat race of impressing, Mamie will say. You always have to succeed, and you have to be proud of yourself. For example, while writing an algebra test, her right arm went numb once and swelled up. She pushed through it, just worried about what other people would say about it if she didn't get an A. There's still a deep reverence for her father in parts of Sioux Center to this day, flavoring the websites about the town, which has grown to about 7,000 people in population. Now, in the summer of 1962, just a few years after the Navy, Bill was attending a church camp in Red Deer, Alberta, where Hahn himself was giving a recruitment pitch for the Dordt College. That's where Bill met young Mamie Hahn and was immediately drawn to her biblical nature, as he called it, especially compared to the women he'd met in the Navy days. As for Mamie, she was head over heels in love with Weibo Ludwig, says her mom, Deborah. But Bill Ludwig hadn't finished high school, and Hahn, who desperately needed students, liked this spirited young man. He gave Bill a chance to challenge the entrance exams, and Ludwig passed. Over time, Hahn and Ludwig became extremely close, engaging in long discussions about the history and beliefs of the church. Bill would pick up homeless people and give them meals, which Hahn didn't really understand, but different kind of Christian, I guess. In college, Ludwig was said to be unpredictable and pretty random. He would study all night only to fall asleep and miss the test, or break curfew by riding around all day with a cop. He and Mamie were married in 1968, when Ludwig was 26 and Mamie 21. She promptly dropped out of college and had a baby girl called Harmony, followed almost immediately by a son named Ben. Weibo studied general arts and would teach in a Christian school for a small time. At first, he felt his checkered past made him feel too guilty to go into the ministry, but he also had such a desire to reach out to those young Dutch immigrants like himself who might have overlooked the church as children. In 1970, he went off to the Calvin Theological Seminary in Grand Rapids. He was working in funeral homes and psychiatric hospitals to support his growing family while attending the school. This place still exists, and it's gorgeous, with over 100 acres of land for its students and faculty. Almost at once, Bill was in contention with the seminary's professors. His first problem were the psych tests for incoming students, uniformly used to weed out mental or sexual issues. Bill claimed it came from a non-scriptural mindset and even organized a petition, but in the end, all the students, including himself, still had to take that exam. Now, in the exam, it was determined that he might have been charismatic, but he was petty and constantly pushing the limits of authority. That's a surprise. For Mamie, it was all babies. She gave birth to Fritz and Bo, Weibo Jr., by the end of Ludwig's 5 years of study. Now, the majority of his professors refused to endorse his ordination. So rare was this that only 1 in 90 students had this happen to them. But Ludwig appealed to the board. Those sitting at the time say he got in with the Reverend Hand using the old boys network. Bill Ludwig was only misunderstood, said his father-in-law. And he had sacrificed so much to become a minister. Misunderstood just wasn't the right word. One of the biggest things about Bill, one of the board members said, was his deeply held conservative views on the male-female relationship, which were harsh even by Christian Reform standards. Ludwig increasingly saw himself as the kind of believer found in the Old Testament, starting the journey to Weibo Ludwig the prophet. If he once felt too much a sinner to preach, that was long gone. I felt that I had been worked over historically to lead, he would say. The Board of Trustees accepted Ludwig into the ministry by a 23-27 vote. And in 1976, Ludwig got his first ministerial call. Off he went to Thunder Bay, Ontario with his wife, who had just added baby Joshua to the bunch. So if you're counting, that makes 5 children for the Ludwigs, under the age of 8. Ouch. They were bound for a church where the 2 previous ministers hadn't lasted very long. But Ludwig was eager to begin his ministry and hopefully to save those young Dutch people, just like he wanted. A particular sore point to Bill was the large number of Dutch girls dating Italian Catholic boys in the uptown. When he refused to marry one such couple until they did more religious study, their parents got understandably angry. It's hard enough to marry a Catholic to a non-Catholic. Can you imagine both religions being against it? Anyway, after 2 years on the job, Ludwig was inevitably suspended. But as luck would have it, a congregation in Godric was just starting up, breaking up from the established Christian Reformed Church in nearby Clinton. Godric, Ontario was just a gorgeous city right on the coast of Lake Huron, just west of Toronto. The committee wasn't entirely keen on Ludwig coming in at first because of his Thunder Bay troubles, but a local veterinarian named Bill Schilthus convinced everyone to allow Ludwig a 6-month trial. A few years younger than Ludwig, Schilthus was also an immigrant from Holland and unhappy with the loosening of church restrictions. A stern, efficient man, Schilthus believed that if you don't choose God, you will die. Even before Ludwig arrived, he was quarreling with church members who didn't seem as concerned with sin, discipline, and hellfire. Gotta be concerned about hellfire. Schilthus thought many were there to do the devil's work. His most fundamental belief, and it holds to this day, is that the first cry of a baby is a sin. At first, Bill Ludwig was generally appreciated by most factions. He was handsome, charismatic, and Mamie, of course, was friendly and had a gorgeous singing voice, which could carry the whole congregation. Like many in the group, the Ludwigs had young children. With yet another baby, a new girl, Mamie Jr., that made Ludwigs a family of 8. Linda Bruinsma recalls being excited at first. It was pretty ideal, she said. He seemed really energetic and outgoing, and we were a young church ready to make a presence in the community. She thought, great, he's going to make some waves. But then, Ludwig's interest in her maiden name and background betrayed this Dutch Christian Reformed chauvinism to her. If you're not Dutch, you're not much. Ludwig eventually considered Bruinsma to be a woman's liber. Still, after 6 months, only a few people opposed Ludwig getting the full-time job. Ludwig's strongest supporters tended to be educated men in their early 30s. Dutch immigrants, earnest, opinionated, and strong personalities, appealing to men who liked to lord themselves over women, let's say. His opponents took to calling him Luddy and said that those who had followed him were being Luddyized. Those who had opposed Ludwig's hiring got visits from their new reverend and Bill Schilthus right away. Ludwig and the elders told these detractors that they weren't following the Bible and risked censure if they didn't repent. Censuring meant they could no longer vote or take part in communion, which is a huge part of church. The sorts that didn't support him tended to be older members, successful at their work, not much book-learned, but rather practical. Men, Ludwig felt, were just like his own parents and other Dutch immigrants, neglecting their children and focusing on materialism. Ludwig had to speak out, even if they hated his rebukes. They were not Christians, he said. They were not interested in taking the gospel seriously for their own lives and their families, except in a kind of ritualistic way or just accommodating showmanship going to church. That's how he felt. Now, the first to get the censure was George Turton, an insurance salesperson. I didn't know I did anything wrong, he said, other than criticizing the way he was preaching. Turton married into the church to his wife, a Dutch immigrant, who was terrified of Weibo and would lock the doors if she saw him coming. You see, on the very first meeting, Weibo had come by and stuck his boots right up on their furniture, a trademark arrogant move. Ludwig says he tends to make himself at home wherever he goes. He just walks right in without knocking, going, "Anybody home?" I would be pissed. Okay, so the salesman was one thing, but then the most respected man in the church community, farmer Cass van der Heuvel. Casse van den Heuvel was also censured. Van den Heuvel had a lot of influence because of his money and wanted to establish something of an inclusive community church, or at least that was what Ludwig feared. He gave the farmer homework to study, but the elders apparently were not satisfied with this effort. Van der Heuvel says he tried to be a regular member of the congregation, but it was Ludwig who made an issue out of his wealth. After his censure, the farmer still came to the church, but would sit at the back row quietly, waiting to be able to partake in communion. I believed they would judge me soon, he says. I felt rejected. Yes, you do feel rejected. And worst of all, you believe them when they say that you are not worthy. So the stress was hard on Van den Heuvel's wife, and as she says, he was later hospitalized. Bill Ludwig felt like he was a prophet. He'll take the Bible and take the pieces he wants. But you can take the Bible and make any point you want to. That's the problem, says his wife. Things soon got ugly. On one visit, an angry church member pulled a shotgun on Bill Scothus and Ludwig and fired into the air to scare them off. In another incident, the two visited censured church member John Baker, who was so angry he pulled out a pitchfork and told them to get lost or they'd be on the end of it. Now, the Bakers had disagreed with Ludwig and his elders on several issues, including the necessity of sending their children to Christian school rather than public school. Look, Reverend, you don't scare me, Baker's wife Grace told Ludwig at one point. I've been through a lot in my life. I don't know what you want out of us. Blood. Ludwig mentioned that he was only staying consistent to the reform ideals. Why are these people so hostile, he would say. Maybe there is something wrong with me. Maybe I should just shut up. It's causing me to get more enemies than I've ever known. But he strongly didn't want to be a false prophet, someone who healed lightly with soft, ineffective words. That was the true cruelty, he had figured. Instead, he would push people to examine whether their actions were that of Christians and accept the resulting dislike. It's the prophet's reward to be abused, in a sense, because he comes from another generation. Often when he is molded for that purpose and the generation is not interested in what he has to say, they need to hear it anyway. But Calvin Seminary says Ludwig took an intolerant view of those who disagreed with him. He judged them to be non-Christians because they disregarded his authority. It was the start of his cultish behavior. The start. Ludwig's consistory began to push a scriptural notion called headship, or the Godhead, as it was known in my church. You'll find the concept in many cults and dangerous churches. It says that women should be bowing to the authority of their husbands as spiritual leaders. We prefer there is one captain of the ship rather than two, Ludwig will mansplain. Ludwig likes to use the example of a man using his wife to scrub the floor with a toothbrush. Instead of complaining, Ludwig told his congregation, the woman should just go along with the suggestion, thus shaming the man. It would be wiser to submit to something like that, he said, in good spirits, and help the husband see the foolishness of what he's doing, rather than create a huge argument out of everything. Now, this one really hits me because there is a similar story, a lore story in my church about a woman being so subservient that she's beat and diligently serves her abusive husband and prays for him at church. And this is seen as admirable. And I've just always felt like that was terrible. He wanted the women barefoot and pregnant, says Linda Brunsma. Basically, shut your mouth and do what you're told. There were some of us who said, no, God gave us a brain and we think we'll carry on. But Mamie was not there. The barefoot and pregnant thing, she had that covered. Now, Damore of the Calvin Seminary says headship was never meant to be used to oppress women. The way he explains it is the Bible calls upon a woman to respect her husband, but that the husband is supposed to empty himself out for her. Hudgen, the Calvin professor, says that a husband is to lay down his life for his wife in marriage. It's a mutual submission to each other, but I don't know. I don't like the concept because it just opens the door to so much abuse. Although things were tempestuous in Goderich, the seeds for Trickle Creek were being sown. Along with Schilthus, Ludwig's biggest supporter was a young social worker named Richard Boonstra. Boonstra was wandering and aimless in his youth. He smoked dope, tried to be a minister, and ended up in therapy. Breaking up with his girlfriend because she was getting too close to him, pretending to be deep, but not. In fact, he fell in love with his future wife, Lois, partly because she didn't ask him too many questions. Boonstra left Toronto for Goderich so he'd have less pressure in his job as a social worker, and moved with their 3 children from Christian school into public school. I don't want to deify Weibo, Boonstra says. I never have. But there are people that the Lord God puts his hands on. That's the nature of religion and faith. And the Lord has put his hands on Weibo many times. And I have to respect that. But for Lois Boonstra, it was not the same. The scriptures say a wife submits to her husband and everything. Oh, I wanted to hit that one over the head, she said. I had my own agenda, and I wanted to control things. Richard simply insisted that it had nothing to do with chauvinism. As a Christian, you begin to understand that what the order is, and that the Lord speaks basically to me, and I speak to Lois. This is how they say. So it was this heavy-handed approach to governing that really attracted Boonstra, yet repelled many others. Eventually, 30 out of 40 of the families had made formal complaints to the local governing body, Classis Huron. Ludwig and his elders fought hard to maintain control of the church, but eventually he quit. The Christian Reformed Church officially defrocked Ludwig and for challenging its authorities and for schismatic activities. The 10 remaining families loyal to Ludwig formed a new group in September 1982 called Church of Our Shepherd King. The idea for the name was that Jesus had a compassion for his flock, but he was also their king. The kingliness of Christ has been neglected in churches, Ludwig cited. Now, many of the breakaway family members feared the drastic move away from the organized church, but not Bill Schilthus. I don't miss the battle, he said. I miss the beautiful decisions around God's word. Yet, in the middle of the dispute, Ludwig got increasingly close to Bill's wife, Stephanie. Like many others, Stephanie Schilthus had been excited by Ludwig's arrival. The two had become friends on a spiritual level, she said. He's the one that opened the word to me and saw my need for spiritual renewal. But Bill Schilthus, the vet, was out working with animals or at his rural clinic office, leaving Stephanie at home with the 4 kids. She struggled with Bill's ideas about headship. She bugged his authority rather than trusting in it. It's gross, like breaking a horse. Ludwig later complained that Bill was shoving Stephanie on him so he could solve things. One thing led to another, Ludwig admits. I never actually had intercourse with her, but we did fuss. Slowly it became dangerous, and I felt that I was very irresponsible in that process. Both he and Stephanie felt sorry for themselves and needed an escape. Ludwig would later say, the Lord humbled me through that. If you want to play to your games, I'll stick your nose in some of that stuff where I know that you're weak, and discipline will do you good. I saw myself falling for areas where I had been weak historically, he said. Stephanie, of course, blamed herself. I fell. I should have been stronger and said something is going on here that I don't like. When rumor of the affair went around in Goderich, The same people whom Ludwig had rebuked and censured in the church now turned on him with an increased vengeance, hurling charges of improper sexual conduct that continued to haunt Ludwig. They called it adultery, though Stephanie and Ludwig say it was only kissing and fondling. Linda Brunsma, Stephanie's very close friend, went wild. "I have so much anger," she said. "I call him evil, especially, I think, because he put himself in a trusted position and broke that trust." Again, De Moore from Calvin Seminary says it's a complete distortion of what a pastor-client relationship ought to be. It's an abuse of power. Ludwig confessed what had gone on to Bill Schilthus. "I bear as much responsibility in any sin he committed in this area," was what Bill said. The Shepherd King elders started to squabble, worrying about the church being too small, about their relationship to the old one, and about their unconventional beliefs. Ludwig felt he couldn't work with elders that were so divided. So in 1982, he and his family took leave, returning again to Sioux Center, Iowa. Now, Bill Ludwig preached on weekends and perfected his drywalling skills down in the States during this time, while Mamie was bringing up 4 boys and 4 girls now. There was Salome, who was just born in 1980, and Charity about 3 years later. They were hoping the Christian Reformed Church would review Weibo's case and reinstate him as an ordained minister. The reorganization never happened. It seems being too harsh with one's doctrine while also breaking the rules wasn't a good look for the CRC. After that, Bill Ludwig turned away fiercely from any organized religion. In 1984, Boonstra and Schilthus begged Ludwig to return and help restart the church. But with Ludwig's return to Goderich came renewed conflicts between the church's remaining 3 elders and Stephanie Schilthus. At one point, Stephanie was physically disciplined by her husband and Bill Ludwig and Richard Boonstra. Each of the 3 men spanked her with a belt. She got a whipping very severely. It was extremely humiliating. Was excommunicated, sent away from her children and her home to live in a hotel by herself. She had to study the Bible, write papers of where she'd gone. For a time, she was so broken, she lived in a van. She would cling to God's words, "I will never leave you forsaken." It was a time where I don't remember quite a lot, she would admit, other than it just being a nightmare. Her affair with Ludwig left her shattered, partly because she liked Ludwig's wife Mamie so much and believed she had hurt her friend. Bill Ludwig had sinned, yet Stephanie, was paying a bigger price. It made her so angry. She was the one being kicked out of her family. And he never seemed to say, "Hey, I did shame. It was my fault too." Her husband tries to explain, "We'd been struggling with Stephanie for a while, and this was part of our frustration. Saying, Stephanie, why are you giving us such a hard time? You're destroying everything God wants to do here." So he said, "I don't have any guilty feelings, knowing Stephanie is such a hard person to deal with. And there are some biblical grounds for a rod and the back of fools that don't listen." Ludwig stresses discipline was handed out only after the wrongdoer was talked to repeatedly and refused to change. Physical discipline had its purpose, he says. We don't get punished as adults when we refuse to grow up and continue with childish ways. Worse disciplinary measures were taken than spanking full-grown women, if you can imagine. The shaving of heads, a suggestion from Schilthus from, you guessed it, the Old Testament, which is a handy alternative to stoning people. It's a biblical requirement. It's an act of shame. At first, mainly the Our Shepherd King children had to have their heads shaved when they did wrong. But later, the adults were shaved as well. Everyone in the group except for Schilthus. Ludwig had his head shaved twice, once by his daughter Harmony for failings as a father. Ludwig had never publicly admitted the precise methods of discipline which he has used in his own group later on. He says, "I don't care to publish those, frankly, because I don't think our society can bear it. Our society hates discipline with a passion." So it must have been really bad. Now, in July 1984, the eldest Schilthus child, Trevor, made a call to Weibo Ludwig about his mother. At once, Ludwig came over to take the kids away from Stephanie until Bill got home from work. Stephanie argued with him. But Bill and Mamie took all the kids and put them into their car. They started to drive away, but much as I would, Stephanie hung on to the door handle. She pleaded with Ludwig. She kept talking, jogging, running alongside the car, begging him to let them go. Then she fell. Her ankle slid under the vehicle and burst open. In fact, she still has the scars to this day. Ludwig said he saw what had happened, stopped, and then drove Stephanie back to the house and helped her clean up. Stephanie blamed her own stupidity and fear for the accident. I hung on to the stupid car, but I thought I was going to lose my kids. And guess what? She did lose them for 10 months. Stephanie was banished again to the hotel, but this time, with the urging of friends and family, she went out to a lawyer. A court order was issued, taking the kids from Bill and putting them back into her care. But when Bill saw this order, he thought he'd never see his children again. So he packed up all 4 kids and left for the United States. A warrant was immediately issued in Canada for Bill's arrest. With the help of Linda Brunsma and her brother-in-law, Stephanie contacted American police and child find organizations. The Ontario courts were after the Ludwigs and the Boonstras at the same time for other matters, such as violating local regulations, taking their children out of school. Rather than attempting to fight, the Ludwigs, the Boonstras, and Bill Schilthus and his 4 kids headed south to Florida. In his final sermon before leaving, Ludwig talked about Noah, how the world had become evil and the prophet had to build an ark to save his friends and family. To save himself and his family. Ludwig was doing the same. The men were working as painters and drywallers in Florida to get by. They trekked through Texas, across New Mexico, and up into Wyoming, trying to evade the detectives and police officers, and trying desperately to keep the 4 children from being found. In Florida, Richard Boonstra had his head shaved and was banished from the group for more than a year. Then, in New Mexico, his wife was also given a head shave and left for a time on her own at an isolated motel. She says the discipline was fair. I had to deal with the vanity a lot in that, she says, with the head shaving. At the time, I dwelt on these things too much, on outside appearance. Meanwhile, the Ludwigs had all of their children. In the end, U.S. authorities tracked down Bill Schilthus in Great Falls, Montana. They arrested him and seized the children. Stephanie, her lawyer, and a friend, Linda Brunsma, flew out and picked up the kids on June 6, 1985. Trevor was 12 at the time. He begged his mother to stay with Weibo. Back in Ontario, Trevor took a swing at his uncle. He had a fire in his eyes to go back. Bill Schilthus spent 6 weeks in jail. Then Stephanie decided her affair with Ludwig and Bill's flight with the children wasn't enough to destroy the marriage. If you can believe it, she went back to Bill after he was let out of jail. For a time, Ludwig, Mamie, and Lois had a gaggle of children. The newest of Mamie's was Caleb, which made 9 now. Ludwig always wanted to go to the Peace Country, which was a vast farming territory in northwestern Alberta. He prayed to the Lord to give him and his family 10 years to straighten their lives, to break away from their connection to the material, secular world. I had to take a lead on it, whether I was fit for it or not, Ludwig says. Mamie said that they were having the same disease and the same sickness. They wanted to isolate themselves for the purpose of reestablishing family because it was gone in this society. When the scanty Our Shepherd King flock arrived in Grand Prairie, Alberta, Ludwig contacted Bill and Stephanie Schilthus, asking them to rejoin the group. The answer was a firm no. In the end, Ludwig excommunicated Schilthus, who responded by excommunicating Ludwig. For 6 weeks in the summer of 1985, the Our Shepherd King group, still minus the banished Richard Boonstra, camped in an army tent in Grand Prairie's Rotary Park. The kids collected bottles to pay for camping fees, and Ludwig went to the local meat market to collect bones. He said he had 2 big dogs to feed. However, he cut the meat off all the bones, put it in 2 big pots with potatoes, and made a stew. The local realtor, Andy Hogan, heard of the group's plight and found a cheap property for Ludwig, one that had a creek, a log cabin, and a forest of spruce and poplar trees. The Ludwigs called their home Trickle Creek. Ludwig took a private loan to pay for the place, even though the Bible told them they shouldn't be in debt. After 4 years of hard work, they had paid for the property completely. Richard Boonstra was at last welcomed back, but otherwise, Trickle Creek had shut its doors. Some locals predicted the Ludwigs would never make it on such poor land in such a remote location. At first, the cabin had no running water, no electricity, the soil was only adequate, but the Ludwigs built a large, self-sufficient farming operation nonetheless. They tried to stop eating what they called dead processed food. For instance, they made their own coffee out of dandelion roots, chicory roots, beetroots, and roasted rye. The men drywalled and did some heavy farm work. They pitched in with weeding and planting. The woman took care of the house, picking berries, carrying the children, cooking, cleaning, a sign of their acceptance of headship, a spiritual relationship to their husbands. The Ludwig and Boonstra women took to wearing scarves on their heads even. Or maybe it was just to hide the fact that they had their heads shorn. Some of us felt a little strange at first, says Mamie, but I started to wear it, and then the men in town treated us differently. They'd look at you and say, I respect you. Well, that's what Mamie felt anyway. Weibo Ludwig had to have some sort of cross to bear. So, as the bumpy happenings in Goderich were forgotten, Ludwig and Richard Boonstra's relatives became the new focus. Ludwig believed his relatives had become too worldly. They had written to Trickle Creek suggesting they put aside their debates on religion because in the end, all were brothers in Christ. But Ludwig refused their entreaties. Much of the focus was on Mamie's father, Reverend Hahn of Sioux Center, Iowa, the one who had originally recruited young Bill Ludwig. Hahn had worked tirelessly to help Ludwig in Grand Rapids, Thunder Bay, and Goderich. Nothing worked. But when Ludwig decided if he had to leave the church, all his relatives should leave too, well, that was the last straw. The Hahns felt Weibo had turned on everyone else. He was bound to turn on them too. And that's exactly what happened. Weibo said Hahn had switched sides when the tides turned. And in April 1988, a letter to his father-in-law wrote, "For your continual mockery of the Lord and his servants, you have not only become my adversary, but his enemy." Capital H. After this, Deborah Hahn found it near impossible to speak to her daughter Mamie on the phone. Ludwig would not allow it, she says. Contact turned to next to nothing. Carol Boonstra in Grand Rapids became concerned when she wasn't getting any basic news about how her nieces were doing. Lois would say gossip wasn't important, only reconciliation with God mattered. But fearing that one or two of the Boonstra kids had died at Trickle Creek or perhaps in their trek across America, Carol enlisted the help of RCMP in Beaver Lodge. Social services checked on the children but found no signs of physical or emotional. What? School authorities then okayed Trickle Creek's homeschooling program for the children. In a letter, RCMP Constable Rue said he checked with neighbors who said the children were well-fed, well-clothed, and well looked after. Regarding the shaved heads, this was done as a health measure, he said, because the children stated they had lice. Carol promptly wrote back to correct the RCMP. Their heads were not shaved because of lice, but due to punishment for whatever they did. Lois Boonstra's cousin, Nancy Reinders, and her husband, Gary, of Grand Rapids, sent a Christmas card to Lois. Those form letters updating about how things were going in their lives. Well, it was returned covered in feces. Lois said, "At the time, we were like, well, how do we get them to leave us alone? Let's get innovative." So that's what they did. And of course, Ludwig himself used harsh tactics with his own relatives. In 1988, when his then 83-year-old mother, Mem, sent him a card wishing him a happy birthday, he returned it with a note. "Are you senile, or is there some other explanation for this?" was what it said. Some years later, he even went to her home in Red Deer, hoping to discuss her supposed failings as a Christian wife and mother. Though Mem was 90 years old, she was still self-confident and as sharp as ever. Her own faith in Christ had carried her through the Second World War, the Nazi occupation of Holland, post-war privatization and immigration, all while raising 8 children. Her son's criticisms did not shake her. The 2 church elders she was with asked Ludwig if he would at least give his mom a hug. He said, "I would sooner hug a prostitute." Then he turned to her and said, "You needed to hear that. We're not in agreement. I have some serious things, and you want me to hug you? That makes me feel sick and ucky. Most people in Weibo Ludwig's extended family are churchgoers, even Mem, but they never saw him as a prophet, even if he saw himself that way. Weibo's brother, Fritz, said he was picking on his parents for unpleasantness of the past, wallowing in self-pity and lashing out in hatred with cultistic fervor. And Weibo's letters were fervent, to say the least. He urged his female in-laws to start living right, he said, doing such things as calling your husbands Lord, learning in silence, covering your heads, and in the presence of men too, as a sign of heartfelt reverence you claim to have for the Lord, the strong man of your covenant, acquainted with grief because of you, women. He went on to write, I'm very glad that my own wife, Mamie Lou, is finally having her eyes opened, be it by some means of very harsh discipline in recent years, to see the horror of your worldliness too long at work in her life. That's right, long-suffering, ever-pregnant Mamie was banished from Trickle Creek, and not just once. In the summer of 1988, Mamie arrived back on her parents' doorsteps in Sioux Center, Iowa, depressed and separated from her latest baby, Levi. Deborah felt Weibo was a big fat hypocrite. His unfaithfulness to Mamie was the true sin, yet Mamie was forever being disciplined in unreasonably harsh ways. He always seemed to be able to reason that the Lord forgave him but did not forgive others. Ludwig was embedded within poor Mamie, though, like an earwig. Mamie says she came to see more clearly spiritual sickness of her hometown in Sioux Center, calling it a kind of revelation. Her explanation for being excommunicated on that occasion was her relentless arrogance, because she thought she had a special relationship with her dad and could convince him to repent when others could not. Others being Ludwig, of course. Ludwig inevitably came to Sioux Center to bring Mamie home. They dressed in sackcloths, put ashes in their hair, and stood on the downtown street with signs that testified to the town's wickedness. Sometimes you have to do drastic things to wake people up where they're at, Mamie would say. But it seems to me like it was more about humiliating her in her own hometown. She followed Ludwig home to Trickle Creek and later wrote to a relative explaining that another reason for her excommunication was her refusal to breastfeed her children. In the letter, she said, when women begin to decide how many children they want and start to demand their personal freedom in the sex act by such means as the pill, having their tubes tied, and of course even abortion, then we know that God gets very angry with such arrogance, she tried to explain. Imagine choosing how many children you want. 1 year later, in December 1989, Mamie was again with a newborn and again banished. Ludwig let her out at a coffee shop in Dawson Creek, BC, and she had to stay with a local minister. Filled with grief, she sought her father's support again in Sioux Center, but this time the Reverend Hahn encouraged her to contact a lawyer. Mamie should be tough now, he said, stand her ground. She had a right to be angry and suspicious of her husband, and Weibo, strutting around other women, was enjoying the attention he got. But Mamie flatly refused. I would never get a divorce, she said. In the end, she went back to Weibo, blaming herself for anger and self-righteousness. I think she might have gotten her tubes tied while she was gone, though, because she didn't have any more after this. 11 seemed to be the golden number for Mamie. Lois Boonstra, too, was excommunicated several times. In 1986, she showed up at her family's home in New Jersey with her head shaved, and then she went back. In July 1991, Richard told her father that he'd sent her away, saying she needed discipline because of her rebellion against male authority. At this point, Lois was alone. She was in Sudbury, Ontario, knocking on doors, looking for a place to work and live. Helen Wade, a local, felt awful for her and took her in. Lois was very, very pale. She had that kerchief on, no hair, and she was a broken woman. Wade helped Lois get a job, let her stay with her for about 3 months. But then, when Ludwig started calling, Wade was pretty angry. When Lois weakened one day and called Richard, he promptly came out and took her back home. Lois immediately switched and called Helen Wade a total busybody. In 1992, Lois and Richard left Trickle Creek for the Okanagan after getting into a squabble with Ludwig. During the 4 years they're away, their children refused to talk to them. None of the children were ever banished, except for Bill Skilthus's son, Trevor. He had left Dort College in 1991 when he was about 18 to move to Trickle Creek, arriving in that leather jacket, spiked hair, and was promptly banished for having an attitude. It was all Trevor wanted, though, even with the isolation. He felt warm within this community. And it's no wonder. They had spent so much time trekking across the United States together. I'm sure he just felt part of them. The early 1990s were actually quiet at Trickle Creek. Relatives suspected everyone there had at last knuckled under to Weibo. Maybe because now it was just a bunch of his old kids and grandkids. As the children grew into adults, they each took on a specialty in their work, and inevitably an interest in marriage. A decision was made that the 3 Boonstra girls would eventually marry the 3 eldest Ludwig boys, rather than go around looking for someone new. So, Ben Ludwig, the oldest boy, married Kara Boonstra, the oldest girl, and masterminded the community's windmill and electrical battery systems. He would build engines and fix cars while his wife Kara made soap and kept the commune's dairy. Fritz Ludwig and Dania Boonstra, the next 2 by age, did the hog raising and beekeeping, curing the meats, while Dania made pottery and sewed. Bo Ludwig the butcher and the veterinarian married Renee Boonstra, who was the winemaker. And finally, Trevor Skilthus married Harmony Ludwig, the oldest girl. Harmony grows the herbs for medicines and ointments. She spins wool, she weaves it on the loom, while Trevor Skilthus beekeeps and works on the electrical projects. As you can see, Ludwig believed in hard work was necessary, but he also preached that the Dutch work ethic was out of whack. He decried the way the world worked too much, and then he said, "You don't see people here punching the clock or busting their butt. People enjoy it here. They have lots of variety. It's not boring." They're always busy. I mean, it's so contradictory. He was angry at people for being so busy, but they had to be busy the right way. We're going to end this part here. We've gotten through the beginning part of Weibo and Mamie's life, and now they are settled in Alberta. We're going to take that up for the next part. It will be coming out very soon, within days, so once again, please subscribe so you don't miss it. If you're seeking a way to release yourself from controlling behavior in a group or a church, I highly recommend going to daretodoubt.org, even just to read about what you're experiencing. Please remember you can leave a place like this one step at a time. Thank you, and I'll see you next time. First of all, Weibo Ludwig, starting the journey to why is it so hard to say his name? Just a sec, I'm filming a video about Weibo, what? Things soon got ugly.